Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Not D&D. As always, I'm your host, Jessica, and we're brought to you by EN World Live, which is part of EN World, the leading tabletop news and review site. This week with me, I'm very excited because I stumbled across a really awesome looking game on Kickstarter. So I invited Ryan to come on and talk about that game. Ryan, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I'm stoked.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you about this. So I saw Defragmentation on Kickstarter literally last week and messaged you out the blue and was like, hi, do you want to come on my podcast? Which seems like such a millennial thing to ask, but here we are. So I'm really excited to talk to you about your game. I put some links in the chat for people listening. The game is now currently live on Kickstarter. So while we're watching, if you like what you're hearing, go take a look and show the project some love on there. But for the next hour, we'll be talking about the game so you can hear about it in more details. If you have any questions, you can pop it in the chat and we will answer it live during the show. And if you're listening to the podcast, all the links will be in the show notes. So Ryan, obviously we're going to talk about your game Defragmentation, but before we get into that, I'm going to ask you some questions about you because you're also a very interesting person. So what was your first experience with tabletop games that you can recall?
Yeah, as cliche as it is, and I imagine that this answer is for a lot of folks. D&D 3.5 is where I cut my teeth, so to speak, in the TT RPG world, and I loved it. We never, I think I started playing in like 8th grade, and we had a consistent weekly campaign almost all the way through high school.
Oh wow!
In
That's
the same
really
world
rare.
with most of the same characters that we took, and so very much that was the only RPG experience I had, and we never played anything else ever through the whole thing. And so I've long since moved on to other taverns and dungeons. Since then, I haven't played D&D in well over a decade at this point, but definitely owe so much of my love for tabletop role-playing games to 3.5, and it's wild to think we just had this super long campaign and that just continue to evolve and collaboratively build out this world together, which was very much unlike D&D, but worked for our group. So
that sounds a lot like my group. We've been playing together for about 5 years, and we're playing Level Up Advanced 5th edition now. We started on D&D, but we've been playing the same campaign for such a long time, and it's so rare because I think so many people get a game together of any tabletop RPG as a campaign, and then like someone can't make it, and then someone leaves, and it just kind of falls apart, and you never get the end of the story. So that's really cool to hear that you had that. Do you remember your character? Did you have like one particular character for the whole campaign?
Yeah, I still have my character sheet. I should have laid it out. Yeah, I still have my original character sheet.
Nice.
He was just a fighter named Waker, and I think I used some random name generator online to come up with that name, and I stayed with that fighter for almost that entire time, and it was really cool because when I was getting ready to kind of like, I had other stuff going on and other commitments, and I couldn't continue to play, but the group was continuing, and my character ultimately ended up getting to become the main antagonist for the next leg of the story in that world.
Oh, wow.
So it was a really cool thing to kind of hand off.
So you did the classic trope of you either die a hero or live long enough to become the villain. You literally stayed alive and became the villain. That's really cool. Well, I could stay and talk to you about that for a long time because I'm a massive nerd, but this show is called Not D&D, so I will stop talking to you about your D&D campaign and talk about other systems that you do. So the game we're going to be talking about, Defragmentation, is clearly very far away from D&D, far more indie, kind of a solo journaling game. When did you first start exploring kind of more indie tabletop RPGs?
Yeah, I guess I think the next game I played when I did get back to playing indie games was an indie game. It was Dread, and I loved it, and I ran it for a bunch of folks who had never played any kind of tabletop role-playing before, and it was a blast. And then it had a few of those kind of games here and there. But when I started on my own kind of developing and working on creating games, it was like I had a light bulb moment a few years ago, actually. Just an internet friend, Tony Vacinda of Plus One EXP, had done a Kickstarter for this game called Beards and Beyond that he had been working on. It was about beards and adventures. And it just it never hit me up until that point that someone could just make their own game and release it,
Yeah.
I guess. Like we did a lot of, like, when I was in playing D&D 3.5, everything was so homebrewed. Like we just chopped up the whole system and used it how we saw fit.
Yeah.
But I never had this novel idea of, like, I could just make something of my own and release it. And so I started doing that. I challenged myself. I guess it was 2020, and I challenged myself to design a one-page RPG every month of that year. And
oh wow.
Yeah. And so I ended up releasing more than that over the course of that year. But I released just a myriad of just really broken, really minimalist kind of indie games, just to kind of try to stretch my creative process and explore different concepts and ideas that I wanted to try out. And so that's kind of where I got started on that. Is I just set up a email list, and it was like, hey, I'm going to be sending out free monthly one-page games for the entirety of this year if you want it. And so the first game kicked off because I'm a person of faith, and so I created a very heretical, I guess, or at least heterodox game about the holy family of the birth of Jesus, where you had to fight off the three magi that were basically had become like undead liches. And you either played as Joseph, Mary, or the donkey, and there was it's very PBTA-ish, kind of like playbook-ish style. But yeah, so that was the first one. I kicked it off with that, and it was a blast. And then I just done a myriad of different ones after that. And so ended up running a Kickstarter campaign for a solo RPG called Project Terminus, which is just now being fulfilled. Over a year late, which is very upsetting, but the game just grew. It started out being just very kind of minimalist solo game, and it ended up being far bigger than I could have ever imagined it was going to be, and which I'm thankful for, but it was some challenges for sure. So
definitely. Well, and I imagine you having done a Kickstarter campaign before. So as we mentioned before, Defragmentation is on Kickstarter now. So this is your second project. So you probably learn a whole bunch of things from that first project that you bring into your second one. So it's all a learning thing. Like, hey, we're all just learning stuff when we do Kickstarters every time and seeing how it goes. But yeah, so as we were actually on it, why don't we talk about defragmentation actually? Because I've been talking around it and talking about you a lot, but should we just get into the meat of the situation here? Tell me about defragmentation. So what's the elevator pitch? How do you describe it to people?
Yeah, so defragmentation is essentially just a game about androids and memory loss and how it shapes us. And I do a lot of work around in other areas of my life with RPGs around kind of development and self-discovery and those kind of things. And so that's always kind of in the back of my mind. And I've been dealing with a lot around this philosophical concepts and dealing with this concept of memory and how ultimately how unreliable our memories are. Even if we have what we would perceive to be good memories, and how maybe me and you could experience something and we would remember it completely differently, and the impact it would have on us. And so these are concepts I've just been turning over a lot, particularly in my studies in grad school and things like that. And so I just had this idea of like, what does it mean for memories to shape us? And what does it mean to deal with memory loss? Because if our memories, as unreliable as they may be, make us who we are, what happens when even those memories are not there anymore?
Yeah.
And so I chose this solo kind of journaling kind of way to kind of explore that. So it's very much an existential game. For me, as someone who's played it, it's come across, it's very heavy. It's very kind of like, there's been times I've had to be like, okay, you know what, I can walk away from this for a minute because the aspect of bleed and there's no way to not bring yourself into it. So yeah, and so essentially I'm talking around it, I guess, in some ways, but it's very much just an existential solo journaling game where you take on the role of an android on the cusp of system failure. And so there is some kind of very minimal but kind of latent kind of anti-capitalist kind of themes there, because you're this android in this post-human future who can't afford, for whatever reason, to acquire the upgrades needed to continue without the effects of system failure. And so because of because of that, you have to then go through begin to sort through core memories because you're becoming fragmented, and you're on the verge of system failure. And so you have to go through your core memories, choosing which ones to save, edit, or delete, to essentially make space to curb this defragmentation. But in doing so, you're fragmenting yourself in a different way. You're going to get to continue forward, but who you are on the other side of this is not going to be who you were when you started. And so again, it's really just an exploration around how memories shape who we are, and through this kind of theme of a post-human, world full of automatons who are trying to figure out how to continue and live and be who they are. So
I read the brief for that on the Kickstarter page, and it spoke to me so much because I love a deep existentialist, bit of a dark TTRPG. I kind of love that sort of thing. I'm a sucker for it, and I think that AI as the use for it is really, really smart, because it's something you can understand like in a computer, and it's close enough but far away enough that you can play it without it being maybe too close. I was wondering about your kind of inspiration for it, because one of the things that first came to mind for me is I kind of thought about the film Memento a bit, about the guy with memory loss, and he used Polaroid pictures for stuff, and some of your imagery has that. But what were your inspirations for creating this game?
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because I don't know that I have a direct line. I'm sure there are some kind of subconscious influences that I hadn't thought of. I haven't seen the movie that you're talking about either, so that's something I need to look up.
It's good.
Yeah, and so really, honestly, the influences for this were very just personal. And we might throw up a trigger warning really quick for those maybe who are uncomfortable with death or the idea of memory loss. I lived in a home growing up with a family member, a close relative, my entire childhood, who suffered from dementia and Alzheimer's. And so I spent my whole life, child life and into my teens with her, and watching that progress. And so it's a conversation that happens in our family a lot, because it's something that comes up in our family's history as far as medical history, and thinking through that. And so watching someone not remember who they are, but still being who they are to you, and then days them remembering things and not seeming like who they are. And early last year, I lost my father. And in that, one of the things I realized was that my experience of my father and other people's experience of my father were so radically different, and it caused weird tensions. And sitting around the table, pulling out these old photo books, we're bringing up all kinds of different memories for different people in my family. And it was something that just really began to turn the wheels in my own head about, what does it mean for two people to experience something and walk away with completely different perspectives on it? And what does it mean for us as individuals to experience something and rework it to something that was traumatic, and we take it and we compost it, so to speak, and we rework it into something that can be used for our own growth, despite the harm that it may have caused or whatever. And so really my influences around it were just deeply existential kind of experiences and family history and stuff. I'm sure there's a myriad of other pop cultural kind of references that I'm not recalling, but that are there, obviously, because this is not necessarily a new concept by any means. One that does come to mind, I keep thinking about iRobot, both the book and the movie, and this robot character having dreams, and that being this completely he's having dreams or memories, and there's embedded memories, and to him they're dreams, so I would say that's probably a distant influence on the game as a whole, but very much just kind of birthed in the crucible of this existential wrestling around memory and how it shapes who we are more than anything.
I think that's a really interesting inspiration you have, that, especially from the personal moment you have. I also have something quite similar. My great aunt moved in with my family when I was 16. She had a stroke, and her memory wasn't the same. And it's interesting when you talk about identity as well, but because her memories of some of her life and who she was were so different, it changed her personality a lot, which is something we didn't kind of expect. And she still thought she was in her 20s. and I remember having a conversation with her at one point. She was like, "Oh, I've got to get up and go to work." She used to work as a nurse, and I was like, "Oh no, you're all right. You're retired now. You can just relax." And she's like, "I'm not retired." I was like, "Yeah, you retired when you were like 65." And she's like, "How dare you? I'm 24." And I was like, I am 16 and I don't know how to have this conversation with somebody. So so I think it's a really big topic to kind of create. How did you work to kind of approach that in a game mechanic sort of way?
Yeah, so I try to keep the game is really simple because originally it was going to kind of be more like a zine length kind of project with just prompts and more everything kind of more written out in detail. And I decided that if the more words I put down, the more restrictive the game become. And I wanted people to be able to experience it on their own terms and to be able to interpret it as they wanted. And so the idea of having just kind of cards as prompts with very minimal, like, a time when you experienced healing. And then there's, a table that determines, so it gives it some flavor. You can roll again to determine if it was, this healing was difficult or bodily healing or whatever it is. And all the cards have different prompts on each of them, because I really wanted to leave it as open-ended as possible for people who are playing it, because at the same time that coming in as someone who's realizing like I have a very kind of more dark existential kind of connection to this concept of memory loss, is that maybe for somebody who's coming in who maybe they've experienced trauma or difficulty in life or have a marginalized identity that brings up memories that are less than pleasant. What does it mean to be able to delete a harmful memory? What does it mean to be able to let go? Because not necessarily all core memories are good memories, right? And so how I interpret healing or death or whatever prompt it may be, I may associate it with something that's good or bad, and someone else may do it in a totally different way. And so I wanted to leave it as open-ended as possible, and just very minimal and simple. So again, it's the way it plays out is that you simply you draw a card, and there's very minimal, there's some guiding questions for your journals, kind of entries, but they're still very open-ended, kind of just to help get you going, kind of thinking through that as your character. So yeah, that's really just how it plays out mechanically, very simply. It's simply you just draw a card, there's a prompt, you go with it. And I think it works best that way because, again, like I was writing a good bit for it, and the more when I was play testing it, the more it just felt like I was making people experience the story that I was experiencing, kind of dealing with those prompts. And the way I would respond to that is not the way anybody else would or should have to. And there's times I think for games for that to work out that way, but for this game in particular, I wanted it to be as minimal and open-ended as possible for people.
Awesome. So going into the rules a little bit more, could you talk us through the kind of like the flow of play? So how do we sit down and play the game? What do we need, and what does a session look like?
Yeah, so I designed it to be, like, again, very minimal. It's 36 cards, or one of which contains the kind of the journal guiding questions. All the actual rules and everything are printed on the inside of the hook box, unless you get the digital version. And then I have a setup for a digital kind of platform on playingcards.io that all the rules and everything are there, and you can just play it from that spot. But if you're playing the physical version, you would have your journal kind of choice, whether that's handwriting something, or a Word doc, or even, I guess, audio recording or video recording even. And you roll 3d6 to begin with, just kind of determine the amount of memories you're going to have to go through in this session. So, and you take the two highest numbers. And so say you roll 3d6 and you total two highest numbers ends up being 12. So you're functionally going to draw 12 cards for over the course of the game. And then from there, you'll draw your first card and you'll read the initial prompt. You'll roll a d6 again to determine, kind of add some flavor to that prompt. And then you'll roll a d6 again. And this is something that I didn't have in originally, but you'll roll a d6 again to determine whether that memory is saved, edited, or deleted. And originally I kind of left that up to the player to determine what they wanted to do with that memory. But the more I play tested it, kind of taking that little bit of agency away, made it feel more like a memory loss kind of aspect to it, is that there was some determining factor on the fate of that memory. And so, and then once you do that, so once you draw your card and you roll for your flavor and the outcome, you'll then write a journal entry. And in that journal entry, you're kind of instructed to talk about what that memory was, why it's important, and how the outcome has affected you, for good or bad, or how you feel different, now that this has happened. If this memory has been deleted, who are you now in this moment? How does it change you? Because you can functionally, as this android, you can look down and see that, yeah, I once had this memory, but it's no longer your memory. You can see it written down. And just like when we engage any other kind of stories or anything, I could read someone else's journal and I can have knowledge of it, but it's not mine. So it's not embedded in who I am as a person. And so at that point, that in that post kind of script of towards the end of the journal entry is that memory is no longer, if it was deleted, it's no longer yours. So it becomes kind of an artifact of someone who you once were, but aren't anymore. So, and then you just repeat that process at whatever pace feels comfortable for you, and until you've completed as many journal entries as and drawn as many cards as the original dice rolls you did at the very beginning of the flow of play.
Fantastic. So it's really simple. So you don't need an awful lot of things, and like you say, you can play it digitally. You don't have to like physically have the deck of cards or anything as well. So awesome. With the game, so obviously it's a solo kind of journaling game, and I'm kind of new to solo tabletop RPGs. So what kind of guidance do you have for people that's maybe playing a solo tabletop RPG for the first time?
Yeah, I think depending on the game, definitely create you some space to do it in, and give yourself permission. It's really easy, I think, when we're in groups to, and at least I find in myself groups to kind of have those boundary lines drawn a little better when we come together and say like, hey, these are topics I don't want to discuss or encounter. But maybe sometimes as an individual, once you start playing something, it's like you want to complete it, you want to push through. But especially with solo games, in my experience, someone who tends to write kind of darker, heavier solo games, it's like it's okay to just stop, to walk away. You don't have to finish it. Give yourself space, because being alone kind of with a game and being alone with your thoughts and whatever comes up, it can kind of, to me, it cultivates a space that makes it a little easier to get in your feelings. And sometimes, even when you're not wanting to role play, you don't have a group, so you're not necessarily actively role playing in a way that some people, you might have been in a group setting, but it does tend to hit differently. So I would definitely say find games that are pretty minimal to begin with. There's some very complex solo role-playing games. Some of my games, Project Terminus, is a fairly kind of crunchy solo role-playing game. There's a lot of different moving parts that you have to figure out. But I think if you're venturing into this world, to definitely find games that are have a little bit of less mechanics and more minimally designed, especially on the journaling side of things, for sure. So that would be my definitely my recommendation for folks, and that you just find something that feels good and right, something that you want to be willing to explore. There's one of the things I love about solo tabletop games is that there's such a wide there's a diversity of all kinds of tabletop games, but there's slice of life games, there's very like cozy cottagey games, there's games that are really dark and kind of like existential. There's all kinds of flavors out there, and if you have trouble like me getting into a group on a regular consistency, solo games are a really good opportunity for folks to have a chance to play games and not necessarily have to coordinate all the crazy schedules that come in with trying to get a group of adults together to do something on a regular basis. So
yeah, for sure. I think that's really interesting what you said about safety mechanics, because that's not something I'd really thought about. Because obviously, like you say, when we're playing in a group, always really important when we're doing a game to just do lines and veils, or just agree on the game you're playing and what it is and isn't going to include. Do you have to do that? Because like when you're doing a solo game, you kind of know your boundaries and stuff. Or do you have any process or any things you have to do around safety for a solo game, or is it just walk away if you need to? Like I hadn't really thought about that before.
Yeah, and so with all my solo games that are on the heavier end especially, I've always included kind of a note on safety. Obviously, you're not like necessarily writing anything down or establishing lines of veils or laying out an X card because it's just you, right? But it just ends up being a good reminder to be like, hey, you know your own boundaries, you know your limits. like it's okay to completely walk away like from this game. And I know I kind of have the personality. I do not like to quit things. I don't like to not finish things that I've started, even that are difficult. And that might seem silly to say, like, what if you were like having a hard time with the game, why don't you just walk away? Because like I have this for better or worse, this impulse, like, no, I just need to push through this and go on. But being able to just check in with yourself, I think on a societal level, for the most part, we don't do a good job with that. We don't do a good job of listening to our bodies and thinking like, hey, this is bringing up some anxiety. I know as someone who has anxiety disorder, there's a lot of little signs that it took me a long time to realize, like, this is happening in my body, and this is a sign that I need to step back and catch my breath and realize what is the source of this, and so I think just being aware of who you are and aware of those triggers and lines in your own life is important. But it's always good to have those reminders, like when you're coming into a game or into a space, to say like, this is just a game. It is just a game, but there's this concept called like a magic circle, right? You're entering into a space where like the normal rules of life are suspended, but that doesn't necessarily mean the regular things of life no longer exist anymore, right? If we're playing D&D together, Jessica, like we are barbarians and warriors, and we're going to fight dragons and loot dungeons, and we're not us, but we are still us, right? And there's in that space, it creates a space for a lot of good things to happen, but it also can create a space for us to become disjointed and anxious and and feel triggered or whatever. And so I think it's always good, especially in solo games, just to check in with yourself, to know like what you're playing before you play, and know that like it's a game and you can walk away from it and process it however you need to. Like if you roll, if you're supposed to be drawing 12 cards for defragmentation and you get to card 6 and the prompt is like too heavy, just draw another card. Or if you don't want to quit, like just discard that card and draw a different one. Like it's really simple. Like, it's not, if you skip this prompt or you skip this card or you walk away, like the game's not going to be ruined. Like it's, so I definitely think as someone who has various things that I wouldn't expect to trigger anxious situations in my own body and my own life, that it's good to always be able to check in with yourself and recognize, like, you don't have to have an X card on the table solo playing, but it's always good to just like, you know what, this is too much right now.
Yeah,
I'm going to come back to it later. So
yeah. Absolutely. I think that's really good practice for anyone to do, because it's easy to do in a solo game, like you say, because it's just you. But I think even in a game with other people in, it's always okay to be like, can we stop for a minute? Kind of for any reason. And I think sometimes people are afraid to do that because they're like, I don't want to ruin anyone's fun. I don't want to be that person that's like, can we? So maybe doing a solo game is good practice for doing it just by yourself and realizing that nothing bad happens if you do that. That's a really good point to make. So we had mentioned before, the game is on Kickstarter currently, and I saw your game originally on Kickstarter and was really impressed with the campaign. It's kind of really well laid out. It's really clear. And it was done for the Make 100 event. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I've been aware of the Make 100 event the last couple of times they've done it, and a couple of years ago I participated in Zine Quest, and I was debating participating in Zine Quest again this year, and I just decided that I wasn't going to do it this year. For one, there's just been all kinds of random controversy in the Zine community, it seems like, between Kickstarter and all this stuff, and so I had this other game that I was already working on and kind of moving a different direction as far as from a zine to kind of card base with defragmentation. And I was trying to think, okay, like when can I launch this? And I was thinking like, we'll Make 100's coming up. It's kind of a much smaller event, I think, than Zine Quest for Kickstarter. In Make 100, it's basically creators launch. It's the idea is to launch smaller campaigns. I think there's probably some people who are launching bigger campaigns than others, but it's the idea of kind of just keeping it simple. I think it's usually a good entryway for people who are wanting to do Kickstarters, from what I gather anyway, because there is a sense of community event happening. So it's not like you're not starting like in the middle of May when there's no kind of, your project's out there, and if people see it, they see it, and if you promote it enough, there is a little bit of more kind of cushion there, because your project's going to show up on this event on Kickstarter or whatever. And so I definitely think it's a good entryway for folks who are looking to do kind of a smaller project. One of the staple things for Make 100 is that a part of your project, there can only be 100 of them. So like I could sell 1 million digital copies, but there's only 100 physical copies of Defragmentation available for this campaign.
Okay.
So yeah.
So get involved now. So this is going to be, there's only going to be 100 copies made of the game. So if you're interested in getting a copy, you can go to Kickstarter there. I would have picked myself up one, but unfortunately it's only in the US, which is smart from a logistics perspective, because, you know, if you're going global with 100 copies, that would get so expensive real quick. But there is the digital version that you can get if you're in the UK like me, which I picked up as well. So you mentioned before that this isn't your first kind of Kickstarter. What sort of lessons learned did you have between your last one and this one that you could share with people that are maybe planning on doing their own?
Yeah, I would say the 3 biggest things that I learned is just keep it simple. And don't fall into the pressure, because Kickstarter is going to like update you like unceasingly about where your project, every morning, every night, you're going to get a report. And, you know, every time someone, you know, it's, if you're coming into this, if this is your first Kickstarter, for one, I would say have your project like 99.9% done. Because my first project, it was mostly done in the sense of there was all the narrative and kind of like story elements were there, and a lot of the art was already done. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized I needed this game to be more than what I pitched it. And so it ended up going from 24 pages to 36 pages. It ended up being far more in depth, and the gameplay and the mechanics just evolved entirely in a way that I would have never expected when I originally went into it, because I was like, oh, this is going to be simple, you know, and it just grew. And so I would say get all the growing done before you come to Kickstarter. Make sure that the game is what you want it to be. And, you know, and again, with my first Kickstarter, I really thought it was, but then the more I played and the more I worked, the more I was like, this needs to be more. And it wasn't for it wasn't for the backers. It was because like I wanted this game to be something in particular. And the more I worked on it, the more it grew. And I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful that backers have been so kind of kind and graceful as far as like the delayed timeline. But so I would say when you're coming in, get it all the way done. Like, I mean, don't just have like a passion concept, because what you're going to do is when you do that Kickstarter and you get all those funds, you're going to feel all this pressure and think like, oh, I need to make this game better, or there's these things I want to improve it on. And it's going to just continue to grow and change. So I would say make sure you're there, and you keep it simple. Don't do stress goals, as I like to call them. Kickstarter, there is all this pressure to do stretch goals. And I think, you know, like I could like right now, like even if I didn't have stretch goals established before you started, you can go in and add them. Like you can go in and there's this pressure to like, oh, well, we're at 200% funded. I need to add something else to make sure we continue to go forward and forward. And I would advise against it unless you have it all baked into what you're doing. So for me with Defragmentation, when I came into it, I knew I wanted it to be small, which Make 100 was perfect for. I didn't want to have a lot of logistics stuff. And it's unfortunate about not being able to ship outside of the US. But it just, on a logistic level, some shipping to outside of this country is more than the game cost to some places around the world. And it's just not a stress I need in my life right now as a grad student. And so I would love for physical copies to be available to everyone across the planet. But unfortunately, it's not worth me losing sleep over at the current point in my life. And so I would say keep it simple. Again, keep it simple and have it done. And then just communicate as much as you can about what it is, and then communicate to backers, like especially if something like delays and stuff do happen after the campaign or whatever. One thing I would also recommend is that 2 weeks feels like an eternity. Some people do 30-day campaigns. My first campaign was 2 weeks, and I was only going to do 7 this time, and I regret not doing 7. So if I would have went with my gut kind of decision, the campaign would be over tonight or at 8 a.m. tomorrow, I think. And there's still plenty. So we're like halfway through.
7 days left.
Goes, right. And mostly it's just because I just want it to be over, because I want people to get the game, you know, like,
you're ready to share it.
Yeah. And I'm personally not interested, and this would be different for different people for sure. But like, once we hit the funding goal, like if we didn't get another backer beyond that, I would have been happy because I just want to get the game into the world, and it's something that that I've enjoyed making and want to share with people. And so I definitely think if you're coming into your first campaign that way, on the smaller end of stuff like I am, that's definitely the way to go, to keep it small, reduce all the fluff you can, and triple check your shipping stuff if you're going to do it anywhere else in the world, because every year shipping rates, they just flux, and so you got to really be on top of that on calculating it. So and then I guess the last bit of advice would be just to do it. Like I mean, just do it, like, because it's, who's going to stop you? Like, if you just do your math and put it on there, like, it's going to be worth the learning experience regardless, even if, like, you're not looking to make this your job or whatever. It's just something you have a game that you loved and you worked on and you want to share it with the people. I think Kickstarter, for all of its flaws and issues, especially over the last year with all the just controversies and stuff that have happened, for better or worse, it's a platform that allows you to, like, share the things you make and that you love with the world in a way that you might not be able to otherwise. So definitely don't let anything hold you back. Like, it's just do the math and don't let yourself get stressed out.
And that's really good advice. I completely agree about stretch goals as well, because I think sometimes people are tempted to do more and more and more, and I think it makes sense sometimes if there's a financial reason for it, like, because if you're like, hey, if we get to this much money, it makes financial sense that we'll be able to afford to do this, then that makes 100%. So say if you're like, oh, hey, if we're at this level, we'll add more arcs, we can afford to pay an artist or whatever, then those stretch goals, I tend to think, that makes sense. But if you're just, like, trying to chuck more and more things and make it more complicated for yourself, I think you can so easily end up in a mess. So I always prefer to support Kickstarter campaigns that are a lot more clean and simple. I know what I'm getting, I know what it is, and it makes more sense. And in terms of shipping, like you say, you can always get a digital version for tabletop RPGs. There's always the option for that for there. Speaking of which, digital options, you also do have some add-ons for this campaign, though. So you have 3 of your previous games as kind of, you can pick up as PDFs. Do you want to briefly just talk us through those games and what they are?
Yeah. So a lot of people do add-ons, like physical copies of their games. And again, I did not want to get into any more shipping problems or delays. So I just thought to keep it simple. And so the first big game that I did, which I kickstarted, was Project Terminus, which is kind of at the first of the list on the Kickstarter. It's a 36-page kind of solo game, and it's really interesting because these 3 games, because again, I've created several games over the last couple of years that I could have bundled together in some kind of I think nicer packaging probably, but these games in particular all exist in a shared universe. Or multiverse, depending on whatever language you like. And they're all independently can be played, but they have somewhat of a concept of what we call at Paradox Press alone together. And so in the sense, there's these smaller aspects that allow these games to kind of be played with other people in connection in some way. And so Project Terminus is, again, it's kind of like the biggest game we've done so far. And it is building on what is a forthcoming audio drama called Broadcast 2071. And so I was originally writing the script for this audio drama, I ended up having all these variants and just kind of storylines that I couldn't pursue that I wanted to. And so I was having to narrow it down for the audio drama. And so the idea for Project Terminus came about is like, so how can I take some of these different aspects and this kind of larger concept of Broadcast 2071 and kind of in a meta way make it available to the world? And so every time someone plays Project Terminus, they're essentially getting to play through the events of Broadcast 2071 in a different universe, in a different break off. Because what happens in this story is functionally that humanity is, of course, we're trying to escape the Earth. We use this technology that is supposed to basically make interstellar travel instantaneous. And what it does is it just throws everything, it throws the crap, into the fan. And so you play as a character who essentially who should have ended up on Mars, who lands 50 some odd years in the future in a post-apocalyptic Earth alone. And so that's where Project Terminus is kind of like, that's the kind of key thing with it. It's you're playing through this story and some variation of the story. You're making broadcast in very some kind of similar influence to From the Wretched in a lot of ways, in the sense of the audio recording aspect to it. but the hope is that when people play through that game, that they will release their recordings, so that once Broadcast 2071, the audio drama, is out in the world, is that I'll be able to connect people to these other variants of this story. Like, this is what happened to this, this version in this universe, or so to speak. And so all this different timeline aspects. And so the next game kind of in the bundle is By the Light of a Broken Moon, which takes place 10 years after the event. So again, time things. It takes place 10 years after the actual event of the cataclysm in this universe, but which is still 40 years in 40 years in the past for the events of your character in Project Terminus. And so By the Light of the Broken Moon, you just basically play a young person who was a child when this event happened, and it's the game that is, out of all three of these games, that is most heavily influenced by Jeff Vandermeer's work in Annihilation. You're traveling kind of to ground zero, and it's kind of where things all began before everything just went fully fell apart. And by the time Project Terminus gets around, because the world is kind of riddled with anomalies and kind of like what I would call like reconfigurations. And I would functionally say the environment and the wildlife, because of the events of Project Terminus, have kind of been pulled apart and put back together in ways that are sometimes horrifying and disjointing. And so By the Light of Broken Moon, you play as a young person whose parents have gone missing into kind of ground zero, or what's called the manifest, and you're trying to travel there to find them. And there's some subtle connections between it and Project Terminus, building on the world. Again, all these games are completely independent. You can play them and not play any of the other ones, but they definitely can be interwoven together. And then the last game is actually the last one I made in the series, and it's a much smaller game called Ghost Signals. Out of all kind of the pop cultural influences on this story broadly, this story has probably been most influenced by I Am Legend, the book I Am Legend, and the movie adaptations, the many movie adaptations, whether it be Omega Man or The Last Man or Will Smith's I Am Legend. And in this story, you basically play as a character living after the events of Project Terminus, who keeps receiving these broadcasts from the city. And in the narrative, you don't know this, but in the narrative, essentially, your character doesn't know this, is that these broadcasts are from a character from Project Terminus. So if I was playing Project Terminus and I made all these recordings, one of the things you could do if you wanted to play Ghost Signals, Jessica, is I could give you these recordings or upload them, and you could use them for your gameplay in Ghost Signals.
Amazing.
And so you could listen to them as a part of the whole play sequence. And then Ghost Signals, you're even encouraged to kind of use a map of where you live, because it's very like location based. But there's like a minimal map that comes with the game too, and it's on 2 trifold pamphlets. So all the games they're all solo games. You're alone trying to survive in some version of this post-apocalyptic world, and they're all interconnected in a way that feels like really interesting to me, but I'm biased because there's all these little points of connection that just makes it where the universe gets expanded. The more you play these games, or you're playing with other people or in connection with other people, it just opens up opportunities for this narrative that I've been working on for a long time, for this audio drama, to just continue to develop and deepen and grow in ways that maybe I couldn't even have anticipated. So
yeah, I love that anyone listening to this now, any of my friends that know me, like, oh, I 100% understand why Jess asked this guest to come on, because this is like 100% so what I love. I love the kind of post-apocalyptic survival horror, like one person on your own. What do you do in that situation? And I love that combination that you have, that it is a solo game, but there is some connection with other people, like you say, with the voice recordings. That feels so unique to me. If people are listening to the podcast later, once the Kickstarter campaigns ends, but I believe it ends on like 23rd, 24th of January. It's about a week left.
We got 7 days left. Yeah.
7 days left. So if people are listening to this podcast after that day, or watching after this day, and they would like to check out some of your games, where's a good place for them to go to have a look at them?
Yeah, if you go to paradoxpress.games, you can find them there, which it just links to our itch.io page with all of our games and our whole library, even all the like the one-page kind of games that I've released over the course of that year. So yeah, all the games are just readily available there. The Project Terminus kind of world games are all at the very top for whoever may be interested. And then just all the other ones are kind of below that. So yeah, they're all readily available. Project Terminus will be available physically through the +1 EXP store. I think next month we're trying to get all the distribution stuff figured out to be distributed by them. And then by the Light of the Broken Moon, if you want a physical copy of it, you can actually get it at Exalted Funeral. If you're familiar with Exalted Funeral, is an indie publisher and store, and so they picked up By the Light of the Broken Moon sometime, I think, over the summer, and brought it to print because it was just digital. It originally released as a stress goal for Project Terminus, and but they picked it up and printed it, and so it's available through Exalted Funeral physically. But all the digital stuff you can find, and you can get links to where the physical stuff can be bought through ParadoxPress.games.
Perfect. Thank you very much for sharing that. So is there anything about the Kickstarter or about defragmentation that I've forgotten to ask you about, or any kind of closing summary you'd like to give about the game?
Yeah, no, I think that's it on questions and stuff. I was trying to think, if I did it justice at all, but defragmentation is, again, it's an existential game. It's about exploring how memories shape who we are. And it's something that I'm really excited to get in the hands of backers. Again, when we have a week left on it, I think there's still 64 physical copies left. So there's plenty of time to get in over the next week. We've had 36 physical copy orders and then some digital. So yeah, if you want a copy, I would love to get a copy in your hands because I'm stoked to get it out into the world. And so yeah, go buy a copy.
Absolutely. Well, I've already backed for my PDF version, so I'm excited to get it next week as well, because it sounds exactly the sort of game I want to play. And if you have enjoyed listening to this and think it's the sort of game you want to play, please go and back, because the best way to support indie tabletop RPG creators is to buy their stuff. But so we're coming up near the end of the hour, but the question I always ask is, do you have any recommendations for any indie tabletop RPGs? The rules are, it's not D&D and it's not a game that you've made.
Gotcha. Yeah, I came prepared, as I told you beforehand. I was trying to think which games I wanted to narrow it down to. And so I'm picking the 3 latest games I've played, or one of them I've played fairly frequently over the last year. So I'm going to share 3. Dream Chaser from Imagining Games, Petrucia. They just had a successful Kickstarter for I don't know if you're familiar with the Chew comic from Image Comics.
Oh my god, yeah, I love that comic. I didn't know there was an RPG for that.
Yeah, they made an RPG. He made an RPG of that IP, but his first big game, well, it might not be his first, but the game I know him for is called Dream Chaser. It's kind of an immersive story building game where you basically can do whatever you want, like whatever story or moment you want to live out. If you want to, you want to live kind of a slice of life game or whatever. If you want to slay dragons, you can slay dragons. If you want to be, whatever you want to do, you can do it. It's very expansive. It's a game that I use a lot in a lot of group sessions and stuff like that I really enjoy. So it's very open-ended. It's really fun to play with a group of people. The kind of community dynamics that are built into the mechanics are really, really fun. The next game I would suggest is Signal to Noise from Lunar Shadow Designs. I can't remember when they funded the physical version, but I originally got the digital version. It's kind of it's a bittersweet kind of interstellar epistolary game for 2 players. And so basically one player is on this starship leaving the planet and the other person's on the planet, and you're sending communications back and forth via email to each other. But over the course of the distance in the game, your emails become scrambled. So there's like a mechanic to basically replace letters depending on the prompts and stuff in your letters. And so replace like words and stuff with different letters and things like that. And so your messages become more and more illegible as this distance grows. And it is existential on a whole other level, but you get to do it with another person, which is really cool.
Yeah. Love the sound of that. So,
it's called Signal to Noise by Lunar Shadow Designs. And then the last one is Grasping Nettles from Adam Ebel. Grasping Nettles is a world building game about community, and it's a kind of story over the course of like multiple generations. I think Adam funded it for Zine Quest the same year I did Project Terminus. It's a really cool game. It's definitely as someone who loves world building games and kind of getting into that kind of stuff, definitely recommend it.
Fantastic. So that's 3 great recommendations for us there. So thank you so much. And maybe these are people I will have on as guests on the show, because that's secretly why I ask everyone for recommendations. Ryan, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your game with us and talking about all your other games. Wish you the best of luck with the Kickstarter. I'm really looking forward to getting my copy, and hopefully a few more people will pick up a copy after seeing or hearing this.
Yeah, thank you so much for letting me come on and talk about it, and thank you, of course, absolutely, just doubly thank you for just backing the game and supporting it. So I really appreciate it.
Of course, no problem. It's exactly my sort of existential, angsty sort of tabletop RPG that I like. I don't know what that says about me, but maybe you'll like me as well, and it's your thing as well.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for everyone that's been watching as well or listening. We'll be back next week with a new indie tabletop RPG to talk about. Next week, it's Coven and Crucible we're talking about. So wherever you're watching or listening to this, come back to the same place next week, and we'll be here. And that's all for this week. Thank you very much. Bye.